Hi, my name is Mako Nagasawa. I'm the director of the Anástasis Center for Christian Education and Ministry, and you are listening to our Theology of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. We are on session number 3. If you have not listened to session number 1 and 2, I'd highly recommend that you do that. I hope that you're also a fan of Tolkien, or that as a result of listening to these things that you might become a fan of Tolkien. What we'll be covering today is theodicy, which is an old Greek term for how can God be good despite there being evil in the world. It's a term that refers to story. Does this story hold together? Does it make sense? Are there plot holes? And last time we looked at some elements of theodicy, and I let you discuss some of those things. The topic we'll be looking at today is a little bit of a head-to-head comparison between how is this dynamic portrayed in the Bible. The Bible is a story, and so God claims to be good, and yet there is evil in the world. How can that be? And Iluvatar, or Eru Iluvatar, in the world of Tolkien. And what's also interesting is that in the Bible, God works by speaking, and in the Silmarillion and the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, Iluvatar's main way of acting in the world is singing, although there are other ways which we will get to in the next session. But I do want to focus on this comparison between speaking and singing, because in Tolkien, the singing, God's singing, or Eru's singing, plans the world and history to some degree, not in every way, because elves and humans have degrees of free will, and so do the angels. And so it's not that history is all written by the singing that happens before the world is created, but to some degree it is. And if God is good and claims to be good, then he must defeat evil in some way, and so that part of the music has to be resolved. So in the beginning of Tolkien's world, Eru Iluvatar says Ea, and the music of the Ainur is then manifested physically in the creation of the world, which is called Arda, and the universe around Arda. Also, elves and men appear later. They were not part of the Valar's original music, but they are part of the later music of Eru. So they come into existence. How does this compare with the Bible? Well, again, in the Bible, the main motif is not music, it's just speaking. And this begins with Genesis 1, where God says, "Let there be light," and there was light. And the speaking phrases of God, either "let there be" or "let us bless," happens 10 times in Genesis 1, and 10 begins, and 10 becomes a patterned number, which recurs over and over in scripture in different ways and seems to have the connotation of beginnings. Then God says to Abraham, "I will redeem your descendants from bondage and bless you, and you'll be fruitful." And then that happens. God says to Abram and Sarai, "You will have a son." And then later they do, they have Isaac. God says to the prophet Samuel, "David will become the king of Israel," in 1 Samuel 16, and later it happens, and so on and so forth. This is such an ironclad pattern that the prophet Amos, one of the 12 minor prophets, says, "Surely the Lord God will do nothing except that which he reveals to his servants, the prophets." So get that? God will do nothing except if he speaks it first. And he speaks it to some human partner who is listening, who is also trying to be faithful, and that person becomes a prophet, or what we call a prophet, because they seem to be able to foretell the future. But really, it's a dynamic of God speaks to that person, and then they just repeat what God said. It's really important to point out, God does not cause everything, only what he has spoken in the Bible. And so these things, these speaking events, become real historical events, which means that human free will is genuine. There is a book by Thomas Cahill. He's a popular historian who actually just recently passed away, but Many years ago, he wrote a book called The Gifts of the Jews, how a tribe of desert nomads changed the way everyone thinks and feels. One of the main dynamics of the Jewish contribution to the world is this sense of God speaking and promising to do something and then actually doing it, which gives rise to what we call linear history. They believed that God was moving history along, that it was not simply circular. So the Jews contributed to the world's first linear sense of history and the happy ending. Now, at this point, if you have been in a mostly Protestant, perhaps Catholic context where the influence of Augustine was really high, you might have a question about what I just said. Because Augustine believed in something called monergism, mono meaning one, and ergo meaning will in Latin, one will, that God's will is the only real will in the universe. And so God is omnicausal. And this was problematic and incorrect. Augustine believed in something called double predestination, where God predestined some to be saved by coming to Jesus and predestines others to be damned. If that's the case, then it makes God both good and evil or arbitrary. And it also makes human free will out to be an illusion and not true. And that's a problem, because if humans do not have any moral agency and no free will of any sort, then God is really responsible for human evil, human injustice, the fall, and ongoing resistance to Jesus. So all earlier theologians believed in human free will. Augustine himself in his early years believed in it. Augustine was debating a British theologian named Pelagius, and in the Protestant world, we tend to remember just the Augustine versus Pelagius dynamic. And John Cassian, though, was another leading theologian. He's called the Eastern Orthodox spokesman, and he wrote a sensitive critical response to Augustine, partly in his conferences, in a work called The Conferences. And he's kind of this third way, but Protestants tend not to focus on them, on Cassian. Also, the Second Council of Orange in 529 AD condemned double predestination as a heresy and denied that Augustine's theology taught it. And basically, if you believe in Augustinian monergism, then you have to attribute all of human sinfulness of all types back to God. And that does become a problem. And if you've been brought up in that tradition, then that does become a sticking point. And there are resources on the Anástasis Center website that will talk more about that. Please check it out. So in Tolkien's world, we have a dynamic, and in the biblical story, we also have a dynamic where God continues to intervene. And we find that through God speaking in the Bible and Iluvatar singing in Tolkien. And there are some other ways in which Iluvatar acts also, so which we'll talk about later, but let's be sure of what we're talking about here. In a universe where there's a God who's 100% good, that God has to defeat evil without becoming evil himself. And those are some things that Tolkien picks up on. In the Silmarillion, it says, "It has been said that a greater music still shall be made before Iluvatar by the choirs of the Ainur and the children of Iluvatar after the end of days." In another place, Tolkien says, "If any change shall come, and the marring of the world, or the marring of Arda, is a way to describe the impact of Melkor and his evil on the world, like he affected the physical world, and the marring be amended, Manwë and Varda may know, because they're the closest in thought to Eru Iluvatar, but they have not revealed it, and it is not declared in the dooms of Mandos." Dooms in this sense doesn't necessarily mean a negative thing. It means the fate declared, or the plan of Mandos. And then in a later book called Morgoth's Ring, there's this conversation between Finrod and Andreth. Finrod is an elven king. Andreth is a mortal human woman. And they're discussing the origin story of human beings. And Andrith says, some say that Eru will find a way of healing that will heal both our fathers and ourselves, and those that shall follow us. But how that shall come to pass, or to what manner of being this healing will make us, only those of the hope, as we say, can guess. None can clearly assert, but there are among us a few, of whom I'm one, who have the great hope, as we call it, and believe that his secret has been handed down from the days before our wounding. This is the great hope, that Eru will himself enter into Arda and heal men and all the marring. Such a beautiful passage. What Tolkien is doing within the story of Middle-earth and Arda is, as I would argue, leaving room for the biblical story. And so the idea that Eru will himself become incarnate as a human being is not there, but there is room for it. And if Tolkien was imagining that there's some kind of tradition, a story, a literary history before Beowulf, which was already Christian, so and it's the earliest English literature, then there must have been a story that the English held on to that fit with the Christian story, that helped make sense of how the English people became Christians so quickly. By the way, Morgoth's ring refers to all of Arda in the same way that Sauron had a ring and sought to control people's minds, those who wore the other rings of power. With Morgoth, Morgoth also had a ring in some way, but it was all of the physical world because Morgoth wanted to control all matter. And so he invested his power and dispersed his power into it in order to try to control it. He gave power to other evil beings and in that way weakened himself. And that is why Finrod and Andrith are talking about the healing of the world. Will Eru enter into the world to heal the marring? Okay, so once again, this is kind of the big story at a high level. Now, how does Eru Iluvatar continue to intervene in this world? Well, primarily through music. There are other ways, which we'll get to in the next session. But for now, I'm going to stay with the theme of music because it is so beautiful. So in the Silmarillion, Tolkien says this, and it is said by the Eldar that in water there lives yet the echo of the music of the Ainur more than in any substance else that is in this earth. And many of the children of Iluvatar hearken still unsated to the voices of the sea, and yet know not for what they listen. The sea longing, or the desire to see the ocean, the waves, to hear the crashing of the waves on the shore, and ultimately to sail into the west, to Valinor, to the undying lands, to be on the sea in some way, is just a beautiful picture of what it means to have your being resonate with a kind of music, a kind of rhythm or pattern. And this is seen in Ulmo, the Valar of the waters of the sea, because he is closest to the music of Eru Iluvatar. We see other examples of people being influenced by music. In The Hobbit, the dwarves sang, and something Tookish stirred in Bilbo Baggins. So when Bilbo is hosting all of the dwarves, at first he's reluctant to go, but then when the dwarves sing the song of their ancestors and their people, something stirs in Bilbo, and then he is willing to go. He's kind of becomes an adventurer. Then in Fellowship of the Ring, in the book, there's this very interesting encounter the hobbits have with Tom Bombadil. Now, who Tom Bombadil is, I'm not going to get into right now, but Tom Bombadil is the most musical of all the characters. He always speaks in rhymes and in verse. And when these barrow wights, these kind of ghostly figures, are trying to trap the hobbits, Tom Bombadil comes and he sings against them. First, Frodo remembered the rhyme that Tom had taught them. In a small, desperate voice, he began, "Ho, Tom Bombadil." And with that name, his voice seemed to grow strong. It had a full and lively sound, and the dark chamber echoed as if to drum and trumpet. So Frodo begins singing or repeating the poetry. There was a sudden, and then what happens is there was a sudden deep silence in which Frodo could hear his heart beating. After a long, slow moment, he heard plain, but far away, as if it was coming down through the ground or through thick walls, an answering voice singing. And then Tom Bombadil comes. In another example, after Frodo is stabbed by the Nazgul sword on Weathertop, Aragorn takes the sword hilt and sings over it. Now, this is not in the Peter Jackson movies, but it is in the book. And I want you to notice what happens here. And more deadly to Frodo was this: Aragorn stooped again and lifted up a long, thin knife. There was a cold gleam in it. As Strider raised it, they saw that near the edge, its edge was notched and the point was broken off. But even as he held it up in the growing light, they gazed in astonishment, for the blade seemed to melt and vanish like a smoke in the air, leaving only the hilt in Strider's hand. "Alas," he cried, "it was this accursed knife that gave the wound. Few now have the skill in healing to match such evil weapons, but I will do what I can." He sat down on the ground and, taking the dagger hilt, laid it on his knees, and he sang over it a slow song in a strange tongue. Now, the blade had broken off because part of it had broken off in Frodo's chest, and it was causing him to become a wraith, to pass into the unseen world and become kind of a victim of the Nazgul and of Sauron. So somehow this weapon poses a type of challenge to Aragorn, but he knows somehow to sing over it a song. Why does he do that? Right? It's just kind of this mystery. It's not really explained in the story of the Fellowship of the Ring itself. But if you back up and you look at the role that songs and singing and poetry plays, then it becomes a little more clear, especially if we recognize Aragorn knew something about his ancestors and his heritage and the ways that in which the heroes, the good characters, fight the evil characters. It is actually using song. So here's a great example of that. This comes from the Silmarillion in a chapter called Of Beren and Luthien, which is one of the greatest of the chapters. And this is a contest between the elf king Finrod Felagund versus Sauron in song. And it's powerful. Thus befell the contest of Sauron and Felagund, which is renowned. For Felagund strove with Sauron in songs of power, and the power of the king was very great, but Sauron had the mastery, as is told in the Lay of Lathian. And I'll just read a portion of that. He, meaning Sauron, chanted a song of wizardry, of piercing, opening, of treachery, revealing, uncovering, betraying. Then sudden Felagund there swaying, sang in a song of staying, resisting, battling against power, of secrets kept, strength like a tower. And on it goes. I wish we had time to read more of it. So songs are a battleground. That's the most epic rap battle ever. There's another instance where songs are used to pass on wisdom, and they help people to recognize the wisdom that others have through the songs. So when elves and humans first make contact, there's the story of these men who meet Finrod Felagund, and he has a harp, and it goes like this. Now, these were a part of the kindred and following of Beor the Old, as he was afterwards called, a chieftain among men. After many lives of wandering out of the east, he had led them, other people, at last over the Blue Mountains, the first of the race of men to enter Beleriand, the western side of the continent. And they sang because they were glad and believed that they had escaped from all perils and had come at last to a land without fear. Long Finrod Felagund watched them, and love for them stirred in his heart, but he remained hidden in the trees until they had all fallen asleep. Then he went among the sleeping people, and he took up a rude harp which Beor had laid aside, and he played music upon it, such as the ears of men had not heard. Now men awoke and listened to Felagund as he harped and sang, and each thought that he was in some fair dream, until he saw that his fellows were awake also beside him. But they did not speak or stir while Felagund still played, because of the beauty of the music and the wonder of the song. Wisdom was in the words of the elven king, and the hearts grew wiser that hearkened to him. For the things of which he sang, of the making of Arda and the bliss of Aman beyond the shadows of the sea, came as clear visions before their eyes, and his elvish speech was interpreted in each mind according to its measure. Thus it was that men called King Felagund, whom they first met of all the Eldar, Gnome, that is wisdom, in the language of that people. Indeed, they believed at first that Felagund was one of the Valar, but Felagund dwelt among them and taught them true knowledge, and they loved him, and they took him for their lord, and were ever after loyal to the house of Finarfin. Finrod Felagund was of that elven house of Finarfin. Longer story there. But what we see there is just beautiful, isn't it? Where Finrod's song is something that connects with the men, even though they had not had music that sophisticated, even though they didn't really speak his language, his elvish language, yet they got glimpses of it, and they were somehow moved to envision the sea. And then from there, they had the sea longing. They heard the music, and they could understand the music in the waters of, the waves lapping on the shore, or the dripping of waters, or the laughing of a river. And those are the things that somehow get passed down from the Valar to the elves and to humans. One beautiful resource is the Prancing Pony podcasts. 35th episode, they had a Tolkien Reading Day special where the challenge was to read poetry and songs in Tolkien's fiction and explain a little bit of what does that mean to you. So if you want to understand more about the role of music and poetry in Tolkien's world, and really you could call it a spirituality or way of knowing or way of relating that connects to music, you could start with this. I did, want to focus a little bit on the theology here of Tolkien, and I want to connect Tolkien to Irenaeus of Lyon for many different reasons, which you'll see more of later. Just a quick introduction to Irenaeus. He was a 2nd century Christian bishop of Lyon. He came from what we now call Western Turkey, and he became a bishop, or one of the main Christian leaders in what is now Lyon in France. And he's the most important Christian writer of the 2nd century, easily. His writings are incredible. He is a brilliant writer. This comes from a work that is now called Against Heresies. There are 5 books in this massive work, and this comes from book 4, where Irenaeus says, with God there are simultaneously exhibited power, wisdom, and goodness. His power and goodness appear in this, that of his own will he called into being and fashioned things having no previous existence. His wisdom is shown in his having made created things parts of one harmonious and consistent whole, and those things which through his supereminent kindness receive growth and a long period of existence do reflect the glory of the uncreated one, of that God who bestows what is good ungrudgingly. By this arrangement, therefore, and these harmonies and a sequence of this nature, man, a created and organized being, is rendered after the image and likeness of the uncreated God. Notice that Irenaeus uses also the motif of music and harmony. And again, like Tolkien, this category just makes room for lots of things, both order and freedom, both a conductor, like a master who's teaching others, and players of the orchestra. Each has his or her own part, and each person is important. So it's a way to get at individuality and community, order and freedom in just a beautiful and pretty intuitive way. Irenaeus describes Christian faith like this. He says it's a harmony. He describes all life and all creation as a harmony. And our growth has a kind of harmony to it. There's a music in it. Later in book 5, he says that there is inharmonious streams of influence because of the heretics. Now, such are all the heretics and those who imagine that they have hit upon something more beyond the truth, so that by following those things already mentioned, proceeding on their way variously, inharmoniously, and foolishly. And the reason why he says that is he is critiquing Gnostic heretics who diminish the importance of the body and upplay the importance of the soul. Well, if there is not a unity between soul and body, then a whole bunch of things just start to unravel and fall apart. Also in book 5, he refers to Christian faith as a whole, as a harmony. Men were coming from various nations to the harmony of the faith. So again, that speaks to the internal structure of the Christian faith, that there is both room for individual and community, order and freedom, and that the faith itself is a story that has a kind of pattern, and there's a musicality to it that is something we'll get into soon. And so here's some things to discuss or reflect upon if you are listening with a group or listening by yourself. Number 1, are you and I made of music? Are we made of music? That may sound like a funny question, but consider we use phrases like, hey, I resonate with that. What does that imply? It implies a musical framework. You might think of string theory or atomic vibrations. I mean, to some degree, there is a frequency that we are made of that is happening in us. And perhaps that you can, if you're a science geek, you could think of that as, well, there's a music, isn't there? We recognize patterns. We appreciate harmony, resonance, rhythm, the balance of order and freedom. Also, you can talk about, are you and I made of words? Words. So we see this especially in the Bible, where God has words. He makes things by speaking, and then he frames life for human beings in a moral way. So good and evil are words that indicate things that are bigger than us. We're placed into categories or frameworks of good and evil. The same thing as justice and injustice, or beauty and ugliness. These are things that are larger than us, which we then have to orient ourselves by, or at least that's the invitation. And so we are made of words in some way because we resonate with these words. Number 3, how does the framework of music explain the dynamic relationship between Iluvatar and the created beings? So again, you could talk about or think about this balance between order and freedom, or individuality and community and partnership. And number 4, does Tolkien succeed in explaining how Iluvatar could be always acting in a consistent, good, and loving way towards the healing of the marring? Again, because we're interested in whether this world hangs together I think it does, and especially in this way. We will get into more examples of how Iluvatar and the Valar seem to act together in the world to complement and partner with elves and humans, but we will save that for next time. For now, go ahead and spend a little bit of time thinking about this, thinking about how this story sheds some light and gives some important insights into who we are and what, if you're a Christian, into what Christian faith is like, a resonance of music and harmony. Stay tuned, and we'll see you next time for episode 4.